Hi, I'm Heather Anderson. I'm a nationally certified interpreter, and I'm the vice chair of the Board of Examiners of Interpreters for the Deaf. Here in Rhode Island, there is a licensure process to oversee the enforcement of General Law 5-71. This Rhode Island state law establishes entry-level requirements for sign language interpreters. It also sets forth standards and expectations of American Sign Language interpreters working in Rhode Island, specifically in regards to their role and conduct while on the job. First, I want to start with what it takes to become an interpreter. I think this will help you understand the breadth of what it takes to become an interpreter, why the law was established, and why it's necessary. Say you were born into the deaf community, for example. Perhaps your parents were deaf. With that comes experience. You innately know the language, you know the community, you know the culture, you experience various settings, various registers, you experience different ways that individuals use sign language. So for example, just like in English, a senior citizen's sign language might look a little bit different than that of, say, a younger deaf millennial. There's slang, there's formal register, daily, everyday use. There's a lot to learn, but if you have a deaf family, you're privy to all of that just by your upbringing. If you weren't born into the deaf community, your learning and your language acquisition, it might look a little different. Maybe you are sparked by interest of learning sign language, so you decide to take a class. From there, you're typically required to go do some observations. Observations, watching how deaf people interact within the community, learning, seeing how deaf people live, seeing what their culture entails and how they use their language. Now, it takes about 5 years to become comfortably fluent enough in the language. And for those 5 years, you're constantly making yourself available in the deaf community. You're constantly volunteering. You're constantly making relationships. You're constantly evolving into a whole different lifestyle for yourself. It's a different community. It's a different culture, which, by the way, is beautiful. Well, learning the language of the deaf, and once you're at a comfortable, fluent level of language acquisition, that's when interpreter starts to study the skill of interpreting and learning the skill of interpreting. It's not easy either. That usually takes about another 4 or 5 years. So combined between learning the language and learning the skill of interpreting, you're looking at about 9 or 10 years. 10 years is a long journey. 10 years of learning the language, learning the act of interpreting, and understanding the skill of it, getting to know, learn, and grow alongside of the deaf community is an experience most interpreters are eternally grateful for. And I don't even know who I would be without this other language or culture that I use day in and day out. I also want to go a step further and say, although you may become an interpreter and you use the language, you know the culture, and you understand the skill of interpreting, it's a completely different skill set to know the verbiage in which setting you do interpret. So for example, the medical sector. An interpreter will need to know a myriad of medical terminology and how that terminology looks, not only in ASL, but how that terminology sounds in English. You want to know your most important tool to verifying your message has been understood? That you tried all you could to provide the most accessible message? Perhaps you've come across a deaf patient that just doesn't seem to understand the message at hand. Maybe it's the first time you've met the patient, or maybe it's a patient that you've been seeing for quite some time, but something just isn't right. You have a hunch that your patient doesn't understand you, or perhaps you do not completely understand them, even with an ASL interpreter. Here's a big tip. Offer them the services of a deaf interpreter. Offer that patient the chance to work with a deaf interpreter as well as the interpreter that you use for everyday appointments. Explain that you are the one struggling to understand and would like to try what you've learned here to work with 2 interpreters, one hearing and one deaf at the same time. With the deaf interpreter being a key component to your interaction using clear, visual, Native American Sign Language with your patient, and then that deaf interpreter watches what the patient's message to you is. The deaf interpreter then takes the message from the patient, code switches to match the language better understood by the ASL interpreter, and the interpreter then takes the patient's message interpreted by the deaf interpreter and put it into a much clearer message for you. You can get down to the nitty-gritty, learning more about your patient than you probably ever have. And while enhancing rapport and trust at the same time. Honestly, I would recommend using a deaf interpreter for any prepubescent child, deaf child specifically, anything psych related, any initial serious diagnosis and discussion on course of treatment, or anything trauma related, be that mental or physical. A second language user working day in and day out, like myself, as a sign language interpreter, I work with various individuals with a variety of language use. Everyone has their own signing nuances, accents, language acquisition level. I'm speaking interpreters. I may struggle receptively understanding certain signers, be that age, race, language use. Perhaps they were generationally deaf, or maybe they learned sign language later in life, maybe entering college. My interpreting approach or language use and modification may not necessarily be the same for each deaf patient. And as much as I try to make my interpretation clear and consumer specific, my best may not be good enough. I am a second language user after all. If you think about it, most spoken language interpreters tend to work going from their L2, their second language, into their L1. So, for instance, English to Spanish. As you can imagine, their fluency in their mother tongue is much more accurate than that of going into English, their second language. Sign language interpreters tend to do exactly the opposite. They tend to work mostly into their L2, their second language. And our quote unquote articulation, if you will, may not be suiting your consumer. That's where a deaf interpreter comes in handy. It's not necessarily the patient, it's us, the professionals, that need the extra help. The 4 takeaways are: takes a long time to learn ASL. Number 2, takes a long time to learn interpreting. Number 3, interpreters need to be familiar with specifically the medical terminology in the sector that they work. And number 4, use deaf interpreters. Now that I've taken the time to tell you about what it takes to become an interpreter, and that learning ASL and knowing ASL is completely different than knowing how to interpret, I'm going to go ahead and start to review the law, the Board of Examiners, and the like. This slide is a snippet from General Law 5-71-9, and that talks about licensure regulations for interpreters for the deaf. It outlines the role of an interpreter. It defines interpreters It defines specific interpreters. So for example, intermediary interpreter, which would be a deaf interpreter, an educational interpreter, so an interpreter that works in the K through 12 setting, and even what a screened interpreter is compared to a certified interpreter. It's all there in the law, and it's outlined clearly, which you can read. It also outlines how to be granted licensure and what skills, what training, and what requirements you need to submit with your application to be granted a license. Let me just start with this. It is not appropriate for you to use maybe somebody in the office that knows ASL, or a friend that signs, or even that patient's family member. Not okay. It's not okay to use those types of individuals as interpreters. They do not have the specific training or the specific learning of the language and the specific language it takes to relay medical information. And in doing so, you put yourself at risk of liability, and also that person who obliges. Suppose that person skewed the interpretation, told them to take their meds the wrong way. Maybe what they're telling you, the deaf person is saying, is not what that deaf person is feeling, experiencing, or trying to explain to you as their medical care provider. We encompass your tone, your pace, your mannerisms, your bedside manner, or lack thereof, maybe. We take your message, the intent, the way it's relayed, the spirit in which it's relayed, the spirit of who you are as a human, as their doctor, as their healthcare provider. We take all of that and we relay it to them the way you are, the way you spoke it to them. We just translate it into a different language and put it out there just like you did. We oftentimes also culturally mediate. So what's more, like I was saying before, is that interpreters are fluent in both their L1, which is usually English for sign language interpreters, and their L2, which is usually ASL. They have the knowledge and skill of interpreting, and specifically have the jargon or the verbiage and the schema to go along with the setting that they are interpreting. So for you, the medical setting. I'll give you an example. So if you said something as simple as, yeah, we've come to find that you have diverticulitis. And I signed something like, I just signed, oh, we happen to have found out that you have diverticulitis. I literally fingerspelled diverticulitis. A better interpretation of that would be expanding on the concepts that are at hand. So diverticulitis actually encompasses 3 concepts: intestines, pockets on the intestines that have formed, and food getting stuck in those pockets, causing an infection, right? In ASL, that would look something like this. you could see it. You could see the intestines, you could see the pockets, and you could see how food was lingering, causing an infection. Way more succinct than just saying, you have diverticulitis. That's what deaf people need. They need to see it. Please, please, whatever you do, please use visuals whenever you can. It will help not only the interpretation and give the interpreter some framework and some visuals to work off of, but it will also help the patient visualize how their body functions, what is wrong with their body. They can see it. You can explain it to them with the help of visuals. For them, they have to see it. They have to visualize it. That's how deaf people think, in videos and pictures. That's what we as interpreters need to suit. So while we're interpreting and showing and utilizing 3D space as ASL does, that helps them understand their healthcare diagnoses. Although our roles as interpreters are vastly different than a medical provider, we do have common goals. Our goal is to provide complete and full access to that patient's healthcare. So your message, the spirit of your message, yourself, your personality, all of it, we naturally interpret that. We interpret that, and that naturally fosters the development of rapport to you and to the patient. We also monitor for the provider's understanding of the patient, their experience, their questions, concerns, and also vice versa. That the patient understands the medical provider and that they understand the complexities of their healthcare needs so that they are able to make autonomous, informed healthcare decisions. So how do you do that? What's your role? How do you ensure that your patients are understanding their healthcare? Provide Rhode Island Department of Health licensed interpreters. Provide interpreters that understand the medical setting and the vocabulary and terms that go into that setting. And also use not only sign language interpreters, but the use of deaf interpreters. The Board of Examiners of Interpreters for the Deaf was established to provide oversight to General Law 5-71. The Board of Examiners has 5 seats. 3 are certified interpreters working in the state of Rhode Island that are licensed, and 2 are consumers. All must be living in the state of Rhode Island for 2 years prior to their appointment, and they're appointed by the governor of Rhode Island. That volunteer can continue in that position for 3 years or until they are appointed a replacement on the board. A board member is limited to 2 consecutive terms, so 6 years. Of those 5 people, 1 will be appointed the chair and 1 will be appointed the vice chair. The chair works with the board manager to create an agenda for the meetings, works with the board manager in providing advice and oversight of the application process, as well as the qualifications for interpreters that are applying, and advice as requested from the board manager. And the chair and the vice chair, does exactly the same. They support the chair in creating agendas and advising the department. So what's required to submit with your application? How do you become a licensed sign language interpreter practicing in the state of Rhode Island? Well, first you have to be of good moral character. You have to meet the requirements of the law and the regs. You have to hold a national certification for interpreting that was granted by the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf or its successor agency, or provide a verification of passing a state screening approved by the department in consultation with the board, as well as evidence of passing the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf written exam. which is something you have to do before you take the national performance exam. Or if the interpreter has yet to take the RID written exam, they have to show proof of workshops, classes, courses in sign language, deaf culture, ethics, interpreting, and submit that with their application. They have to also provide a clean background check and follow the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf and the National Association for the Deaf Code of Professional Conduct for Interpreters. They also have to pay the Rhode Island Department of Health licensing fee. Working in the K through 12 sector, the licensing requirements are as follows. The interpreter has to have all of the requirements that I just stated prior, as well as taking the EIPA, the Education Interpreters Performance Assessment Test, written and performance. They must pass the performance with a score that the board approves of. And the test must be at that of a skill level approved by the board. Once interpreters become licensed and are granted that license, they have to satisfy CEU requirements. So if you're a state screened interpreter with a screened license, that means you have to complete 5 hours of continuing education. If you are a nationally certified interpreter, you follow the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf guidelines, and that is 80 hours of continuing education within a 4-year period. Of those 80 hours, 10 of them must be under the auspice of power, privilege, and oppression. So how do you know if the interpreter is licensed? Where do you find that information? Right on this link. So you go to the Department of Health website, which is https://health.ri.gov/find/licensees/. I'll show you here. Once you get to this page, you go to the second column over, and it says profession or facility type. There, you go down to Interpreters for the Deaf, and it will automatically pre-populate all of the interpreters that are licensed in Rhode Island. So right here, you will find me. I am indeed licensed. You can also pull this up further, and you can see that this is my license number, and this is when it was issued. My license was first given to me on October 5th of 2009, and it's expiring on 6/30 of 2021. There's also the Code of Professional Conduct, which I've linked here, and that will bring you to RID. I will go and show you the first 7 tenants. There are 7 tenants. However, with under each tenant, there's also 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, there's subsets. So I'm going to go over the first 7 tenants, and all the subsets you can peruse at your own will. So this is from the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, which is our governing organization. And here are the first 7 tenants. Interpreters adhere to standards of confidential communication. Interpreters possess the professional skills and knowledge required for the specific interpreting situation. Interpreters conduct themselves in a manner appropriate to the specific interpreting situation. Interpreters demonstrate respect for consumers. Interpreters demonstrate respect for colleagues, interns, and students of the profession. Interpreters maintain ethical business practices, and interpreters engage in professional development. This document is pretty lengthy here, so you can see each subset underneath each code, each tenant. So what if an interpreter violated either the law or the RID CPC, the Code of Professional Conduct? Well, first, ask that interpreter their name and ask them their credentials. Ask to see their license. Be sure to jot down their full name, and then you can go to the website and check and see if if they are. Verify if they're licensed, just like I just previously showed you. If there's an interpreter that's not licensed that is interpreting, make sure you get their name and make sure you get their credentials that they say they have. You can then reach out to the Department of Health and let them know that there's a rogue interpreter working in Rhode Island that's not licensed. In my experience, I've seen them send a cease and desist letter so that they'll say, stop interpreting in Rhode Island, you're not qualified. Or if you are, get a license. And if they do hold a Rhode Island Department of Health license, you have recourse to file a complaint under that said interpreter's license. So, like I said, obtaining their name and credentials is important. And they have to disclose that information to you if they're working in Rhode Island as an interpreter. So let me show you how to do that. It's in the same place as I just showed you. So I'll go back to the license. And as you can see, go to the interpreters for the deaf. I'll use myself as an example. Okay. So here it is right at the bottom. File a complaint on Heather Renee Anderson. Here, you fill out the person affected. I suppose that could be you if you were affected and your message did not get across specifically the way it should have, or if there were any sort of conduct issues. It could be you are the person affected, also could be the deaf person affected. So I suppose you could put in either or. Then you can put in who you are submitting the complaint, or if it's different from above. I would say if you're filling this out, put the deaf person as the person affected, and then yourself as the person submitting the complaint. Here you can just jot down exactly what happened. It's important to provide the date, the time that it happened, who was there, what other witnesses were around, and then an anecdote of what you experienced. What additionally helps is to go to the RID Code of Professional Conduct that I just showed you and cite the specific tenet that they broke. Even go to the law and cite the specific part of the law, the statute that they broke, and put that in there. That lessens the work on the back end when they do their investigation, who aren't so knowledgeable about interpreters or interpreters for the deaf. So this will help them do a lot of their legwork. Once you put in your anecdote here and you're all set, you submit your complaint. You will get a letter confirming the receipt of that complaint from the Department of Health, and you will get it in the address that you put forth here in the complaint. And that concludes my in-service on the Rhode Island General Law 5-71, the Board of Examiners for Interpreters for the Deaf, how to verify a license, how to submit a complaint, and also what it takes to become an interpreter and what that interpreter has to instill to show up to your appointment and effectively interpret for both yourself and the deaf person. I hope that you learned a lot in this session, and I hope that you take away some information that you could utilize in your profession.